So on the shark bite, show me which numbers you want to see. Do you go over on your hand or between slope and intercept? Slope is a ratio, rise over run. Intercept is where it crosses the x or y axis.
Oh.
You tell me. Interesting way to sit there. Okay, so I saw a lot of 2, so we'll do that one, but then the other ones, if you were a 1, raise your hand. That is 2, okay. If you were a 3, raise your hand. If you were a 4, raise your hand. And 5. Only 2 and 5. Those are the most, so we'll do those. For the evaluating one, we're putting both of these in. We're gonna have 4 times the absolute value of -7 minus 2. Remember that evaluating absolute value and solving for absolute value work differently. So here you would do whatever's on the inside first. Make the inside positive. So positive 36 was the answer to that one. Questions on?
Wait, you think it's like
Simplify. For evaluating, that's how it works. If it asks you to solve it, that would be different. Number 5. Okay, so if we were looking for the slope of this, we would need to get it back in slope intercept form. So get rid of 2x. Divide both sides by 5, or divide everything by 5. Have y equals -2/5 x plus 2. And from this, which one is the slope? Now, if it had asked for the intercepts, then you could have put 0 in, solve for one, put 0 in the other one, and then solve for the other. So make sure you're keeping those straight, especially for your quiz and test coming up next week. Other questions on that one? So, we have finished slope, finding slope from a graph from 2 points, from an equation, all those things. We finished intercepts, finding it from a graph and algebraically in different formats. And then we just finished graphing yesterday, graphing in slope intercept form, standard form, by vertical and horizontal lines, and by intercepts. So the last lesson that we have to talk about is linear transformation, which is basically a combination of stuff that we've already talked about, but different at the same time. Before we get into the notes, I want to remind you and tell you one thing. Remind you that your Delta Math is due on Friday for slope part 2, x and y intercepts, and graphing linear equations. You won't have a Delta Math on what we're doing today, but you will have a practice that is still due on Friday. So on Canvas, when you go into the linear transformations practice, I don't remember exactly what it's called. There are 2 options. You can either do the Desmos activity, or you can do the Go formative activity. Either activity you have to email me so I can go in and double check and grade it, but that is also due on Friday. But you have a choice of which one you want to do for that one. All right. So with these notes, there's some background information that next time I do these notes, I will put in, build in so that we don't have to write all this stuff. But for now, we have to write in some information that will help you throughout the rest of these topics. So wherever you have spaces, be it at the bottom, at the top, wherever, I'm gonna write at the top. There are 3 transformations we're gonna be talking about. 2 of them are for slope. 1 of them is for the y-int. I'm gonna write the y-intercept one first. So for the y-intercept, the transformation that applies to it is the word shifted. The y-intercept can be shifted up or down. So when you see those words, it's talking about the y-intercept, it's talking about moving the y-intercept up or down. So y-intercept gets added or subtracted. And that's it. And right now that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but when we get into the problems, you'll be able to recognize, okay, is this for y-intercept? Is this for slope? And so on and so forth. For slope, there are 2. One is when it's been reflected. So all of these that we're about to do, always compare it to an original function, which I'll write here in a second. F of x equals x or y equals x. It's always comparing to that original. So if it's been reflected, that means your slope is negative. Always. So anytime you have a negative slope, it's been reflected compared to the original. What is it? So then it would be reflective. So all of these are comparing to the original, which I haven't wrote down. The other way we describe slope is on its steepness. If the slope is greater than 1, so like 2, 3, 5, keep going, then it is steeper. If m is greater than 1, if the slope is bigger than 1, it is steeper than the original. If it is a fraction, so something between 0 and 1, some fraction, it is less steep. Do you have to know this? Yes. So I put 0 as less than m, which is less than 1. That just means the slope would fall in between 0 and 1. Now, these 2 things have nothing to do with each other. If it's negative, it could still be steeper. We're looking at the number itself and is it negative. So those 2 things are separate things. So it could be reflected and steeper, reflected and less steep, it depends. So I'm going to put the original so that we know what we're always comparing it to. So this will always be the original function you're comparing everything else to. F of x equals x or y equals x. Where the slope of this is what? What would the slope be here? X. The number in front. 1. And the y-intercept is 1. So for your original, your y-intercept is always 0, your slope is 1. Everything else we're comparing, how did it change from the original to whatever it is now? Using these words and graphing. Yes. Or, sorry. Right? So not only do we have to be able to describe the transformations, what changed, what happened, but we also have to be able to graph them. So we're going to work through different examples of what that looks like. So for this one, you have some f of x, I'm sorry, I didn't write one lesson. multiplying or dividing. So slope is always multiplying or dividing, y-intercept is always adding or subtracting.
Multiplying and dividing is
okay. So for number 1, we have some f of x plus 2. So if we're thinking about this original and we're adding 2, that's something that the y-intercept is changing, something but the y-intercept. The slope is not changing at all. Well, it's still 1. It's still the original. So in this case, we would write that the slope didn't change or stay the same. And then we also have to say, what did the y-intercept do? So we're going to use the word shifted. If it's adding 2, did it shift up or down? Up. So we would say the y-intercept shifted up 2. So you have to put all of those. Which one is it that you're talking about, the y-intercept, the slope? What did it do? It shifted. What direction, up or down, and then by how many? 2. Questions on that before we move on to number 2? And number 2, we have a negative 1/3 being multiplied to f of x. Multiply. That's something about the slope. So the slope is going to change. Am I adding or subtracting anything? No. So that means the y-intercept in this case stayed the same. So I can put that. Every time we describe, we have to say something about the y-intercept and something about the slope. Whether it stayed the same, whether it shifted, whether it, whatever. Right? For the slope, 2 things are happening. It's negative, so that means it was reflected. You can put these as 2 things happen, so you can put them together, or you can put them as 2 separate sentences. It's up to you. I'm going to write them as 2 separate sentences.
so what if it's not negative?
Then it wouldn't be reflected. So negative, reflected, no negative, not reflected. That's it. It's already negative.
That's what you're saying, it's not.
So if you don't have a negative, you wouldn't add one in.
Oh.
Right? And then the 1/3, is that greater than 1 or between 0 and 1? So this would be less steep. So the slope is less steep by 1/3. You can say by 1/3, by a factor of 1/3. It's 1/3 less steep. There's a bunch of different ways to say that.
So you don't have the negative one?
We already did that. It's reflected. So you could combine those 2 sentences. The slope was reflected and is less steep by 1/3, or you could write it as 2 separate sentences. Do you have any questions on that one?
Wait, don't you want let's do negative 1/3?
No. The negative just has nothing to do with that part. Those are 2 different things. So now we're still going to describe here just so we get used to it, but that's not what it asks here. So we're going to describe and we're going to plot the 3 points. So if I have some f of x minus 3, which changed, the y-intercept or the slope?
The y-intercept.
The y-intercept. And then what did it do? So using our words, it shifted down 3. Did the slope change? No, so I'm going to put the slope stay the same. So again, it's not asking in this one to describe, but it's good practice to describe what happened. So now in this one, we just need to plot 3 points on this that would match this or represent what we just talked about. So if the original is wrong, if the y-intercept shifted down 3, where would the new y-intercept be? On the y-axis. So you would put a point there. That's always going to be one of your points, the y-intercept. If the slope stayed the same, we just need 2 other points with the same slope. So it does not matter where you want to go. You want to go up 1 to the right 1 twice, you can do that. If you want to go down 1 to the left 1 twice, you could do that. If you want to skip a couple, you could do that. You just need 3 points. For the slope, that's our slope for this one, yes. Okay. If it said to make a line, then we would connect these dots to make a line, but that's not what it's asking for here. We just have to create the 2 points, the 3 points. Questions on number 3 before we do 4? Okay. What's happening, what's changing in number 4? So it's multiplying, so is this steeper or less steep? Steeper because of the 2. Okay, it's steeper by 2, it's 2 times as steep, either or, steeper by a factor of 2. Did the y-intercept change? No. So the y-intercept stays the same. So if the y-intercept stayed the same, it's going to be at the same point 0, 0. And then give me an ordered pair where I can put the next point. So you're saying the 0.21?
Oh, the slope is the 2.
Yes. So give me the ordered pair where I can put that.
Hold on. 2.
Would that be going up 2 to the right 1?
No, positive 2 and
So I can do positive 1 up to x1, y2. Give me another point.
positive 4, 2.
I think that'd be over too much. What were you saying? So -1, -2. When I say ordered pair, it's always x, y first. So you could have done these 3 points. You could have went more positive. You could have went more negative. You could have spread them out. Let's say you didn't want to do this one, but the next one, it doesn't matter. You just need 3 points.
So the next one.
Do you have 3 points?
Yeah, I think so.
So there is no more points. Other questions on number 4? Number 5 is a little different. Because it gives you the original. And it gives you this next function, this new function. And you have to describe what's happening based on the comparing it to the original. So shifted up, shifted down, is that y-intercept or is that slope? So this is the y-intercept. Comparing the original to the new one, what happened? Did it shift up or down? Up. And how do we know that? Because of the positive side. So for the slope, comparing it to the original to the new, is it steeper or less steep?
Less steep.
How do we know that? because it's less than 1. So really, less steep is going to be any fraction where the numerator is smaller than the denominator. Questions on that one? We're going to start the next one, and then I think that might be all. We might have time to do both of these. I'm not. Okay, so we have to again describe and graph. So this one we are going to use a whole line. So what happened with this? Is steeper and what? And it reflected. So it reflected and is 3 times as steep, or reflected and is steeper by 3. Either or. What about the y-intercept? Y-intercept stayed the same. Right, so if the y-intercept stayed the same, it's going to be at the same point, 0, 0. So I could go down 3 and now if I go down and left, is that going to give me reflected that I need? I need to go to the right. So I could keep going down 3 and to the right, 1. And then going up 3 and to the left 1.
Wait, didn't you say I don't have to have more than 3 points?
This one doesn't say plot 3 points, it says graph a line. So once you have all of your points, connect them in line. When you have a line like this, you can really see the steeper or less steep. Think about if you were sledding or skating or something down these 2 lines. Would you get down to the blue line or the original faster? Right. So this one is steeper because of how fast you would get down. What happened in number 2? This would be the last one I asked.
The y-intercept.
Y-intercept shifted what direction right here? Up. What about the slope? Slope stay the same. So what would our new y-intercept be? Positive 2 on the y-axis. The slope is the same, so it's 1. So go up 1, right 1 as many times as possible. And down 1, left 1 as many times. And make your instead of writing the word slope stay the same, you could also write same steepness. That would mean the same thing. You have choices with that. Right? We will continue the rest of this tomorrow. So you do have a little bit of time if you wanted to work on at least one of your delta mass before class ends. Yes.